Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me today. I'm really looking forward to talk about this topic of open source security and how it relates to open source sustainability, and connecting the dots between the two during this session today. And I'm looking forward to your questions and thoughts on this topic. So where do we start? Well, there are multiple ways to actually get started on this conversation. The first one, I believe, starts in the fairly recent past, when over the course of the last 6 months, right before the New Year's and right after, we faced a number of pretty severe breaches in open source software that a large part of the industry was relying on. So right before the end of the year, it was Log4j, and it was followed more in the JavaScript community was two issues which were kind of self-sabotage of Collar.js and Faker.js, two sort of very much used modules in the community that ended up being sabotaged by their owner, who was essentially upset about a number of things, arguably, but also in particular about the lack of sustainability of open source in general. So to be clear, I absolutely don't condone the actions of the maintainer of the two packages that I mentioned, Collar.js and Faker.js. And I believe they're ethically wrong for a number of reasons. And we've had even worse things after that, was packages that actually deleted files on the hard drives of developers that were using them if their IP was placed in Russia, for example. So all of those actions are clearly condemnable and ethically wrong, and there's sort of like a spectrum of wrongness here, right? And I think it's really important to understand that I don't condone those actions. However, they kind of point to underlying systemic problems that I think that we are not taking seriously enough, and that we haven't taken seriously enough for a very long time, right? So the first real thing that I think we can discuss is sort of the idea of complacency around all of this software that's available for free, as in gratis, that we can just use without paying anyone, to build and deploy code, right? So we have become clearly extremely complacent with this, in the sense that literally we just pull code from the internet, don't check it, barely run the tests on them if there are tests, sort of Google or use different sort of like search tools or data points to make really quick decisions as to how much we can trust that software, and also how much we can trust the developers behind it, because most often we don't even bother to lock our dependencies to a specific version, right? Because we've been told it's not such a good thing to do. And so we pull in the software, essentially give the maintainers of all of these software and this software's dependencies the authority and the trust to change the code that we ship to our customers, our users, whoever we're shipping code for, and hope for the best, right? And I mean, there's a point where we have to realize that this is kind of concerning, and this is a real problem, and it has like really deep security issues. And I think like the time, that time was like a long time ago at this point, but like if we haven't done it a long time ago, we should really do it now. And it's really reassuring to see that the industry is taking this seriously, right? We're seeing, we saw when similar events happened, thinking about Heartbleed, for example, like in 2014, we saw like a real response for the industry through, for example, the Core Infrastructure Initiative that the Linux Foundation launched. And we're seeing a lot more of this today, with a lot more money, a lot more resources, and hopefully a lot more impact in terms of securing our, essentially what has become our software supply chain, right? And adopting best practices, both in how we develop open source, but also in how we consume open source and how we consume software in general. So these are really good things, and I'm really glad to see the open security, the OpenSSF do something about this and launch the plan that they have launched recently. And it's good to see that these issues are really being tackled seriously in terms of consuming open source software and making sure that this open source software is safe. That said, this is a little bit too focused on solving the symptoms for my taste, and not quite enough on solving the underlying issues that are causing those symptoms. The symptoms of the security issues that we see in open source, they aren't just a question of adopting better security practices and how open source is built. They aren't just a question of adopting better security practices and how we use that open source. They're also about really considering how open source is created, how it is built, and how sustainable those practices are. And again, this is really not a new issue. I mean, we've been talking about this for a very long time. And, there's the famous XKCD comic about this, where you see this really large, complex piece of structure that's all held together by a tiny project that some random person in Nebraska has been thanklessly maintaining for a decade, right? And this is kind of the reality of open source still today. When there was the Heartbleed bug in 2014, and like we're talking about 8 years ago at this point, right? We found out that the biggest problem was OpenSSL was the fact that barely no one was maintaining it. People weren't getting paid for this. And the budget that they had to maintain this was like about $2,000 per year, right? So this problem of open source sustainability that's really underlying, we've known about it for a long time. 2014 Heartbleed bug, we had that number. In 2017, there is this great Ford Foundation report that Nadia Iqbal wrote called "Roads and Bridges: The Unseen Labor Behind Our Digital Infrastructure." Right. So, like, we have clearly documented research about this fact, right? There's even like an open source, a conference around open source sustainability called Sustain OSS, right? Which also has been going on for years. I mean, I've attended some of those conferences pre-COVID, right? And we've also seen a number of organizations, for-profit organizations, focused on actually trying to solve that problem. And in a talk that I gave in 2019 called Towards a Sustainable Solution to Open Source Sustainability, I mentioned a number of those, one of which is hosting us today, right? Tidelift. But it's not the only one, but here too, like, this is a problem that we know is a problem for so long that they're actually like long-term businesses, funded businesses trying to solve it. And, yet, despite all of this, we're not seeing a real realization that the problem of open source sustainability the fact that people are just not getting paid to do this work, or not getting paid properly, I mean, or don't have the right amount of time and resources to actually do the work properly, connects to the fact that as a result, well, some things aren't handled well, and one of those things is actually quite important and quite problematic when it goes wrong, which is the security of the software that literally now everyone relies on to build on top of it, right? And when I see the kind of efforts that are where money and resources are being injected in right now, there are not efforts that are focused on fixing the sustainability issue, on attacking the cause, right? There are issues that are tied on preventing the cause from hurting us, right? Sorry, preventing the symptoms of the cause from hurting us. And this to me feels a lot like gated communities, right? And what are gated communities? Well, it's essentially when you live somewhere and you look at the situation and the situation is dire and there's violence and people are scared and they're worried and they don't want to solve the underlying problem. They don't know how to solve the underlying problem. Solving the underlying problem doesn't fit their personal desires. And so instead, they sort of like retire behind walls and with the protection of, guards that they pay, et cetera, right? And what we're doing right now really feels like building a gated community. We're not going to try to solve the underlying of systemic sustainability issues and how we build software. No, we're just going to make sure that we, as consumers of that open source software, don't have to suffer from those. And so, like, I want to be clear here again. Don't get me wrong. Like, all of those efforts to secure how we use open source and to make it easier to build secure open source, they're great and they're absolutely needed. And like, we can do these two things in parallel, and we should, right? In parallel, we can make it safer to consume open source. We can have all of those tools and plans that OpenSSF is building, absolutely. But at the same time, in parallel, we should also seriously consider doing the more long-term work of figuring out how to solve the problem of open source sustainability. So the first thing to acknowledge when we talk about open source sustainability and how much money is spent around these issues is to point out the huge discrepancy there is between the money that is spent globally on developing software, which, rough back of the envelope math tells you is over $1 trillion, compared to the money that is being spent on open source directly. And, even if we add the very sizable investment that OpenSSF is going to make in the upcoming years, and the money that we've seen in other nonprofits and in for-profits, we're roughly talking about $100 million top, right? So that's a multiple number of orders of magnitude between $100 million of total funds over a decade and $1 trillion a year spent on software developer wages, right? And so for that reason, and for also the reason that open source software is actually better and built more sound and really is best when it is built by the people who are using it, right? Like the idea of splitting up open source developers on one side and sort of like industry developers that would just be writing glue code around open source feels like foreign and not a good idea, right? There's like a real value in having people that are using software also building it, and so the discrepancy in the amount of money, and the fact that we don't want to sort of like separate open source developers from, I don't know, for-profit developers. It was at the heart of like the message I sent in 2019, and that I've repeated a number of times as I gave that sustainability talk. And it's really the idea that one of the ways to deal with the problem of open source sustainability is to get more organizations to be part of the ecosystem and contribute code and contribute resources, documentation, triaging bugs, etc. Right? So, and to do that, what we really need to do is explain better, show the value for organizations to contribute to open source. So that's one part of a way to deal with the problem of open source sustainability and the problem of open source security in a more systemic way, right? Is get more organizations to see why they should contribute to open source in a broad set of different ways, and show them how that benefits them in directly, right? Like in the midterm and in the long term, and how it actually benefits their engineers and the work that they're doing. Now, I've always pushed back on the notion of paying open source developers, and I'm going to nuance this a little bit today. I believe there's a very big difference in paying open source developers and paying open source maintainers. That's not the same kind of job. One is like very fun, like you build new software to solve exciting new problems. And the other one is kind of not so fun. It's harder, right? You have to deal with people not understanding the culture of open source, wanting issues to be fixed. It's kind of like if you were providing customer assistance, except for free on your own time, right? And so the maintenance part, I believe increasingly that it probably should be funded somehow. And we're seeing examples where this, or like premises of this, are being built, and quite successfully, right? One of the examples of that is the Mozilla Developer Network. All of the data that, all of the resources that help web developers understand web technology have been maintained and built by Mozilla in an open way for a very long time at this point. And recently, the team that was behind that effort was moved into an openly funded system that is supported by Open Collective. It's called Open Web Docs, and the maintainers of Open Web Docs, previously MDN, are full-time employees of a nonprofit, which is supported through Open Collective by the community and in part by large organizations, right? But there's this whole community-driven effort to support by properly paying and properly employing a number of folks that are there to maintain the infrastructure and do a lot of the heavy lifting, this sort of hard, difficult, underappreciated work of maintaining this resource. I think we need more of this, and I think this is a model that would be really interesting across the board, and to try with a number of strictly open source software projects. And here's another reason why. I've spent a lot of time talking with open source developers that were trying to build a revenue stream on top of maintaining an open source software. And what I've come to realize is that for a lot of developers, for a lot of open source developers, part of what makes open source attractive is it provides them with a way to make a living that doesn't include a large 9-to-5 corporate job. And I don't want to be dismissive of 9-to-5 corporate jobs or working for corporate America or corporate, any country really. But I think it is interesting to realize that there was a lot of people that came to software development and open source in particular that came to it because they were uneasy or didn't fit well in the regular sort of like 9-to-5 corporate world. And, as an industry and as a community, there are sort of like two ways we can handle this. One is to say, well, tough luck, open source and software has been completely industrialized now, and it's corporate. They're corporate jobs, right? And you can just, either decide to fit in or essentially just tough luck, right? Or we can look at this, take another step back and look at this more broadly and ask ourselves the question, is it possible for us as an industry and as a community to actually leverage people that want to work differently? What would be the benefits of that? Could we have people working maybe part-time doing maintenance for an open source project? Sure, they would not be making a full-time corporate job salary. Absolutely. But they would not be working full-time for a corporation either, right? So this might fit part of our community better than actually working full-time for a large company, right? So can we not consider these folks that have different desires and different needs and actually leverage them in a way that suits them way better than the other sort of open positions that the industry has to offer, and in a way that actually also benefits the industry and the community, right? Wouldn't it make more sense to have community members of a project be paid part-time if they're not fully employed by a corporation, be paid part-time to do the actual grueling maintenance work, rather than just hope for the best and pretend that this work is going to happen or doesn't need to happen? I think that there's really something there that we have to reconsider. And that's really what I would want to leave you all with, is thinking about the fact that we have examples of this kind of structure working with international employees, right? Because thanks to COVID, we now have a lot of businesses offering a really easy way to employ people remotely in different jurisdictions, right? So we have the tooling exists. We have a very good example of something like that happening successfully with Open Web Docs. And it seems that we have a real desire within a lot of projects to have people that would be happy to spend time maintaining a project and not be fully employed doing so, but do this as a part-time job, maybe in complement of other work that they would be doing, or whatever else fits them. And I really believe that there is an interesting future here that we should more deeply have a look at, and that might offer a more sustainable, longer term, more profound, more solid solution to the problem of open source security that we're facing right now. And that would also be the ethical and right thing to do, right? Because at some point, once we're finished with securing open source, if we only do this from a gated community perspective, people are going to start asking the software industry about the social ethics of the software supply chain. And at that point, we're going to have a hard time, and we're going to have to do the work of accounting for all of the labor that is done and that is not getting paid. Because, I mean, come on, like it's 2022, right? We can't just rely on free labor. It's not going to cut it, right? So, yeah, my key takeaway, and like what I would really like to see happening, and what I would love to be involved with and help with, is finding a few pilot projects where we can create a similar solution that has been built for open web docs. Find a few maintainers, agree on having them maintain these open source soft projects part-time, funded through community donations, community support, and not only support from individuals, but also support from corporations, and maybe foundations, and see how that works, see where it takes us, and see how broadly that model can be extended in the future to encompass more of the open source supply chain that we've all come to rely on. So that's really all I have for you today. Thank you so much for listening to me. And I'm really looking forward to your questions, and feel free to reach out if you want to talk more about this. If this resonates with the way you perceive the industry, and if there are solutions you would like help to implement, I'd love to be a part of solving this problem. Thank you very much for your time. Bye for now.